Hello, friends. Welcome to Kudomusicology, a Ludomusicology Literature review. It's been a while since I've been totally alone. I guess I did Wombat alone. But it is because we are beginning a new format this week. We're gonna see how we like it. We're gonna play around with it a little bit. I'm gonna resize this PowerPoint window a little bit. Because we are exploring our first monograph. I'm very excited to begin the sequence here with William Cheng's brilliant sound play, Video Games and the Musical Imagination. It's got a really cool cover. I love the colors of the sound play font. And it's a Video Games live image of like the Space Invader, and it's all made up of little instruments. Very, very eye-catching cover. Actually, all Will's books have really eye-catching covers. So I made it a point on this stream. It's very easy to do articles and book chapters, and those are very, single episode processes. We can get through an entire reading in one sitting, and I didn't want to ignore some of the wonderful books that have come out and that I think are really foundational and that we all should be super well versed in. And so I was thinking about how to do that, because obviously asking an author to be on for like 6 weeks in a row is a lot. So my thought is that we will kind of digitally book club this and cover about a chapter a week, so you can read along if you have your own copy, reread along. Hello, 8-Bit Aria, welcome. That we can kind of read it together, and as we go, we can be building up some things that we'd like to discuss and questions that we have, because will be joining us after we finish all the chapters, and maybe lurking, popping in to the streams themselves. I also said he's welcome to come on any of the weeks as well, but I didn't want to ask people to be on too many weeks in a row. But my thought is we'd kind of do like a culminating interview at the end, where we do all the stuff about asking about the process and where it came from, and all the stuff that I normally cover with the article authors. But yeah, it can be kind of collaborative. In fact, maybe I'll start a Google Doc now and just post it kind of regularly in chat that we can add to together. That's a thought. Let's do that. We'll do a new, once it loads, do a new document, Google Doc, and we'll call it Sound Play Book Club. Questions and discussion points. And I can try to add to these as I think of it, but we will just do like one of those like anybody with the link can edit kind of thing. Copy link. All right, we're going to post that. So I will post that every so often in the chat, but that is going to be our one way, just a simple way we can all collaborate and ask our questions and make sure we don't forget them in 6 weeks' time. So I think that will be a good system. Well, we can always refine if we have changes we'd like to make to the format. But anyway, starting today kind of easy because it was finals week, and everybody is kind of spent and we're doing a lot of grading, keeping it simple. And next week I will plan to do chapter 1, and then we'll take a couple weeks off for the holidays, and then do the rest of the book in January, and that'll be great. So, William Cheng's sound play, Video Games and the Musical Imagination, just a stunning piece of literature. This is Oxford University Press from 2014. Great cover again. So I wanted to start actually with the acknowledgements, because I don't know how many of you are like, I ain't got time for that. When you're reading a book, maybe, especially if you only need like a chapter or something from a book, you don't always read all of the front matter, all of the acknowledgements, the foreword, some of the intro can be useful to skim because it often has the chapter overview. But sometimes, depending on what your research needs are in the given moment, that can be very easy to skip or skim. So I wanted to actually take a look at them because I love acknowledgements. It's why I have a kudos stream to give kudos to people. And I think that I find them sort of daunting. I haven't written a full book yet. It's, it's in the proposal phase right now. But I think ahead to, if and when that gets done, oh my gosh, there's so many people involved. It takes a village. And I wanted to take a minute because I think Will Cheng's are really beautiful. I wanted to quote this part. Writing this book was a privilege. The adventure was made meaningful foremost by the many wonderful people who lent their company along the way. Thanks are due to all the designers, composers, musicians, artists, players, journalists, podcasters, and scholars who engage with video games with tireless verve and imagination. Your voices are in these pages. For this, I'm indebted immeasurably. It's so beautiful. But also just really striking. What's humbling and also really beautiful here is the list of how many people. There's I counted, there's almost 150 names listed from just about every stage. And, all the way, the editors involved in the process, advisors at Harvard, folks that were undergraduate professors, teachers from earlier in life, all the way back to family, parents, and just everybody. And I love how inclusive and broad the kudos go here. And at the end, there's a note here. It's notable that this book, didn't just come out of thin air. Everything I think comes out of earlier work. And so we talk often about the catalyst element of some of these articles that they maybe do a conference paper and then it turns into something that they publish, and then they think about where am I going to take this next? Thinking back to like Elizabeth Medina Gray being kind of interested in dialogue and sort of these sounds that are musical but not necessarily classified as music in the soundscape, and how that has led this whole path now of several different publications out of that initial interest. So similarly, there were actually a couple different sources that were kind of fleshed out and expanded and reworked into chapters in this book. So chapter 4 on the Lord of the Rings Online actually was an ethnomusicology article in winter 2012. So if you wanted to read like the earlier version, you could always go look that up. And then shorter versions of chapters 3 and 5 appeared in Oxford handbooks as standalone chapters. So interesting there that you have to get permission from the original publishers when you're going to do something like this, when you're going to rework an earlier chapter or an earlier publication. So that's kind of one of my first questions to put on the list is a little bit about hearing about that process, because that's something that I've never considered having to do, and I sort of wonder what all that entails. The two that are in the Oxford handbooks, I imagine, was a little more straightforward because this book was also Oxford, so it wasn't like a cross-publisher thing. But I do wonder about the Ethnomusicology Journal, if that was at all a challenge, or, I imagine it's pretty common to have this type of permission given. But I'm just interested in the details of that, because that's not something that I've reached in my own career. So definitely a question to think through. I also wanted to look at the foreword, also something that is sometimes skipped because it's not necessarily by the author. It's usually sort of a generous gift of time and effort on the part of someone that you look up to. So it's really humbling when you ask and somebody's willing to do it. So Richard Lebert writes a really good foreword as well. So starting by talking about just how pervasive gaming is in our culture, even just the phrases around the games we play and get in the game, and let's see what some of the other ones were. Game the system. This isn't a game. Play along. Just how common the wordplay is, and gets right off into playing games and play itself as being kind of seen as frivolous or diversionary or preventing you from, you know, taking care of responsibilities. So he says gameplay is multivalent, unsettled, shifting, and dialectical. Thus, playing games, a kind of synonym for fun, is irresponsible unless pre-justified by being earned. Work first, play and game later. Broccoli precedes ice cream, which makes me smile because for a lot of us in Ludo, the play becomes the work, and I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but I game a little differently when it's for work than when I am just sort of freely playing. Like there's games that I'm not necessarily having a critical ear toward, but it's very different when I'm looking for something and when I'm looking at something. So it ends up getting conflated in interesting ways. And then of course there's work kind of within games that is interesting, that we seem to be drawn to order and to routine. And I'm thinking of games like Animal Crossing and Stardew Valley, where you're doing a lot of kind of time and in-game labor, but it's gamified and it's different than doing it in real life. I also just, got to put the Gaster Ludo Musicology shout out with the broccoli precedes ice cream. All the food references somehow made it into the PowerPoint, so I don't know if I was just hungry when I was working on this last night, but that's in here too. Yeah, that's technically don't own part of your own dissertation due to copyright laws. Yeah, it's wild. So that's something I'm interested in hearing more about, especially as I get close to hopefully doing my own monograph and being under contract to do my own monograph. There we go. Games, this is, again, quoting. Games allow us to imagine what isn't, but might be. Utopic moments, the ludic again, hiding in the shadows of the dystopic real world, all too familiar. To state things bluntly, the game of life has but one outcome. The ludic provides an imaginary interruption of that inevitability and the myriad fears and setbacks that confront us, the darkness within and the darkness without. A video game's playful enchantment, structured on terms that as players we get to set, makes possible a fairy tale world, a world of magic, a world utterly not our own but still familiar. The games replicate the familiar and the strange, character types, narratives, sounds, musics, and more. Their wonderful strangeness is recognizable. And so this is a thread that gets picked up in the introduction and kind of throughout the book, that there's a lot of these binaries and oppositions set up within gaming as there are in the, quote, real world, good versus evil. Games often involve ethics and rules and a sense of right and wrong and fairness, even in maybe less structured forms of play. There's still some kind of a boundary around that experience or a magic circle, depending on who you're citing. So Leppert writes, Cheng's book reminds us that the graphically rendered imaginary world is one in which life itself can easily hinge on the semiotics of its sounds, many of them musical, all of them meaningful. And so here, sounds are not limited to music. There's plenty of exploration in these pages of sound effects, of voices, of live chat. Basically any source of sound is really meaningful here. Musical excess is also a focus throughout, and there's also plenty of instances where we're drawing surprising connections with opera, the operatics of video game music, the drama, the spectacle, and it's most salient in the Final Fantasy VI chapter, but comes out in a lot of places of like excess and going beyond boundaries and transgression, and sort of the relationship between staying within the bounds and moving beyond them productively. And there's an interesting little section after this comment about opera where Leppert makes a comparison to Moulin Rouge and the Spectacular song in particular, and just sort of like the visual, dramatic, and musical excess in Moulin Rouge and in mostly all of Baz Luhrmann's works, most of them, and how that actually has interesting resonances with games. I thought that was fun. And we know this, that sound carries meaning and potential meaning, and any gamer has that learning curve of learning how to parse those and understand what they are telling us. And here we cite Roland Barthes. So, that's how you know you're doing the good game scholarship, is when you start citing the critical theorists, right? So Roland Barthes argues that we listen variously when sounds portend uncertainty, unfamiliarity, and especially the possibility of danger. So we listen to decipher the secret, the future, but also transgression. Just so lovely, beautifully written here. I love that. This is a really great foreword. And then we praise, as we should. Will here is drawing on just such a huge range of discourses. And he has a whole section in the introduction to follow on methodology and just all of the different scholarly disciplines that he refers to, at least half a dozen, and it really, really makes it clear that this stuff is important. It's worthy of study. It sheds a light on all of our understanding of music. It goes so far beyond games, even though games are the case studies here. And it's nice because while there is a tiny bit of discussion in the intro, sort of the apologetics, right, of like games are still kind of culturally fraught and associated with being juvenile or frivolous, diversionary, not serious. And so scholars do have to kind of contend with that. He really doesn't spend a ton of time having to justify, hey, games are art, we can do this. He actually, when we get to that point, he kind of uses it for a different end, which is really fun. There's just a note here that we can engage on multiple levels as well, that there's a huge body of knowledge and scholarly rigor behind everything, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't engage with like fan communities and ethnography and interviews and observations as well, and find them just as important and meaningful as the scholarly sources. So, brings us to the introduction itself. I like this one because it resonates. My little Mario Paint chapter from way back when, I opened with kind of a similar here's my origin story anecdote. So actually Will Gibbons does the same thing in Unlimited Replays, talks about like his early experiences with gaming. So I love that moment of insight into where we all started with this. I sort of talk about my early attempts to try to figure out music on like a little Fisher-Price xylophone, and that's sort of play with what I was hearing. And then, my brother bringing home the Nintendo when I was 5, and like all the connections there, that as the player 2 is the one who was mostly watching my brother play the games. It sort of opened me up to hear things because I wasn't, attempting to perform and win and do the platforming or whatever I was trying to do. I was able to kind of absorb different things about the game that he wasn't even really catching because he was playing. So similarly, Will Cheng's father brought home the NES when he was 4, and his older brother got to play. He wanted to play along, and his father handed him the Player 2 controller, which I love this quote, which unbeknownst to me at the time had zero functionality when it came to this game's single-player mode. In practical terms, I might as well have been holding a potato. And so the older brother beat the game, but then Will was saying, I was on that journey with Mario from start to finish as well. Like, in a way, I may not have been the one with the hands on the controller, but, I was there, and I must have been, it's not like I didn't influence my brother in any way by being in the room, either distracting him or causing. Ooh, we get to mod. This is fun. Can I do that from here? How do I moderate? If I have a mod, maybe kick that. I can't believe I need moderation. This is almost flattering. Why would anybody want a chat bot? That seems just so awful. Thank you. Amazing. Anyway, so being involved in the play, even if you're not the one with your hands on the controller, kind of reminds me of when we had Sarah PC on, and or it wasn't even on this channel. It was in the AMS Ludo study group roundtable at AMS. She talked about like the value of using Let's Plays or having someone play the game while you're observing, and how there are other modes of access, or even how playing poorly is sometimes like what we're looking for. And I know in my case, I'm often looking at sort of failure states, which I don't necessarily find if I look for a Let's Play, because a lot of those people are very good players, so they don't necessarily trigger all of those. Oh, no worries, Andrew. Thank you for grabbing it. Appreciate it. So, yeah, because if we only cover the games that we are really good at, it sort of limits our field of study. So, there have to be other ways that we can find access, and whether that is kind of relying on other players or being that more participant observer, that's fine. So, or even just reveling in your own ability level. Like me playing a Souls game, I'm going to have a very different experience than somebody who's good at those. So, I'm going to hear different things probably. Although I guess Souls games, kind of everybody dies a lot, but there's going to be things that I'm not as fluent in, and the combat's going to go differently and all that. So, I love this quote on page 4. Games really put the make in make-believe, urging us to reimagine the limits of our agency, identity, and embodied experience. Oh, so good. It's like a line I wish I'd written. So just as the Nintendo came home around age 4, Will started piano around the same time. And so mentions that he grew up with a daily hour of piano practice and an hour of gaming, which was sort of framed as work and reward. And then it's just like saying like, oh, I wish I could make this into like my superhero origin story about like that being a point of connection that like made me sort of listen to games in a different way. But he's like, a lot of people nowadays have grown up with both, and that not being all that unusual. But what's really interesting here is so there are so many connections that Will Gibbons and Will Cheng and basically everybody, and even like Ryan Thompson's dissertation gets into, just all of these ways that gameplay and musical play involve these similar metaphors and ideas. And actually Tim Summers' book Introduction gets into this too. So basically anybody that has written extensively on gameplay and musicality has noticed like we use a lot of the same ideas in both. So to name a few of very many, both gameplay and musical play involve the apprehension, interpretation, and manipulation of science and materials within technical constraints and customs. Gaining proficiency in either exercise requires determination and practice. And as we know, speedrunners and fighting game players, there's a virtuosity with it too, because of just the thousands of hours of dedicated practice. If you've ever watched a speedrunner Twitch channel when they're just trying to get a speedrun, versus watching like a summoning salt video that like sums it up for you and shows the moment that they actually do get it. They have to cultivate this whole community while they are also intensely concentrating and practicing and hoping that they get, the good RNG or whatever. And most of the time you watch those channels, you aren't going to see that like magic moment of beating the record by a second. You're just going to see a lot of like, oh, I missed that exploit, so like the whole run is done. But maybe they keep practicing to just like practice the other elements. But it's really so many hundreds, if not thousands of hours. So in both music and gaming, there's the importance of performance, collaboration, and competition. And they also, have the single player mode, not just the co-op mode, because music does accommodate solitary contemplative engagement and practice. You at your instrument in the practice room. Both are said to have therapeutic, rehabilitative, and analgesic effects. Both have potential to facilitate trance flow and immersion, and both possess transportative powers, ushering us into otherworldly spaces and alternative states of mind. And these are just some of the connections between games and music. There's so many. In social function, technical craft and vocabularies of appraisal, commonalities between music and games abound. Listening for resonances across these two art forms stands to deepen our comprehension of both. And that's really what this comes down to in the end, is that understanding of one inflects our understanding of the other. And here we cite Roger Mosley on sort of applying game metaphors to real-world musics in heavy quotes, thinking of chamber music as co-op mode, thinking of Chopin's Minute Waltz as speed running, and sort of, the utility of making that connection instead of only applying sort of the classical method to the game, but going the other way around as well. It's a very playful approach, but what does that actually illuminate when you do that? Games offer ways of interacting with music and sound that might not be practical or even possible in the real world. So, including really transgressive forms of musical engagement, which is fascinating. But, he goes into how transgression itself is often of interest. It's a common trope in narrative, to have the maverick characters and things. But he says, engagement can be just as meaningful and maybe even more so when you are following the rules, when you're playing along, as Kerry Miller has shown. Play can end up rewriting our own sense of what's possible. And so there's an interesting thing to look at the folks that just totally break a game, right, and exploit bugs. A lot of speedrunners do that. They'll exploit a bug in order to shave seconds off. But a lot of the most interesting things happen because somebody is engaging with the system. Because if they go too far beyond, if they're just totally cheating, they're not necessarily going to be seen as an expert player. And some of the most interesting things are happening just at the edge, but still within bounds. So there's a lot of knowing where the boundaries are and exploring the liminal spaces between where the game ends and where the real world begins, and that liminal space that we inhabit between them. So rule breaking is often romanticized, and how often have we seen when art is labeled transgressive, that's seen as a compliment. But there are limits. Things that are too radical become alienating. So, and I had to put this quote in here because Ryan Thompson was like, you have to put the peanut butter quote in. So yet again, I have a food reference. Chess players who set fire to the game board during a match are clearly transgressors and may be dangers to society, but they aren't likely to be hailed as creative or virtuosic chess masters. It would likewise be odd to spread peanut butter on a piano's keys during a recital, but performers who do so shouldn't count on being venerated as concert pianists in the conventional sense. So we recognize that there are limits. So both musical and ludic systems can reward those that push boundaries while keeping them in view. Those who are at the edge, but also participating within the system or the magic circle. And there are different levels of games. There's, the video game itself, but there's also maybe you upload Let's Plays on YouTube or are doing, Twitch, and you're competing for followers, competing for likes, competing for subs. Certainly if this is your profession and you're trying to earn money, that's a game that has suddenly very high stakes because it's your living. And some of these sites are making it increasingly hard to make as good of a living because they've renegotiated some of the percentages where somebody used to be able to make more even at the higher levels of partnership, and then some of these things are getting renegotiated, and it's really interesting to watch that gamification. And some of these top streamers are moving to other platforms and things if they're not getting a good enough deal where they are. So it's I've been particularly interested watching YouTube streaming attempt to enter this space and sort of poach some of the top Twitch streamers in the light of some of the recent Twitch changes. And see how successful or not they have been. And there were a lot of money thrown at some of those folks as signing bonuses in order to switch them over to YouTube. And then, of course, there's folks that were banned on Twitch that then start streaming on YouTube. And anyway, there's a whole meta of the folks that game for a living that is now very public in a way that wasn't 10 years ago. But there's also gamification in the sense of a flame war about gaming on forums and sort of winning comments, winning, Reddit gold or whatever. And there's also gamification of like the idea of trash talking in first person shooter matches, that's a form of the game in itself. And there's, maybe an art to that. That's not a space that I inhabit very much, and I think I would be a little stressed out by it. I don't think trash talking comes natural to me, but there are folks that find a lot of pleasure in that, in doing that, even just locally with friends in the same room. So a lot of different levels of gaming beyond just the text of the game itself. So the title has multiple meanings. The idea of we play with sound in games, right? But also the notion of soundness, of something being sound, safe and sound. The sense of safety and the distance that sort of allows play. And so like this is a sound venture we have embarked on. And so this is where, again, looking at the borders and the transgression and the boundaries of play can help us actually understand the social order and the expectations, because it shows us the rules and the borders that we might not notice otherwise. So that, especially, I'm thinking of the final chapter that looks at harassment over voice chat in Team Fortress 2. So the liberties taken in and with games can teach us about what music is or isn't, how it works, what it's good for, and why and to whom these questions should matter in broader contexts. So one focus of the book: all in all, the sounds of play and the play of sounds can do much to expand conventional wisdom about orality, performance, expression, creativity, authoriality, liveness, authenticity, labor, free will, aesthetic autonomy, violence, and a host of additional subjects. It's amazing. What can practices of gaming tell us about human agency, identity, and embodiment? I explore that all the time. What can gaming tell us about embodiment? How do video games incorporate, complement, and compete with other media? How might engagements with games and game audio inform the theoretical, practical, and political stakes of the real-virtual divide? What, if anything, distinguishes sonic transgressions from other types of rule-breaking behavior? And how can games inspire reflections on how we, as scholars, critics, designers, composers, performers, listeners, instructors, and fans test and tinker with everyday sounds in all their material signifying forms? Big list of questions. These are sort of the central questions of the book. So we do have a walkthrough of the chapters at the very end, a literal walkthrough in this case, not me just claiming something as a walkthrough like I normally do. But here we also get sort of a walkthrough of the big ideas that structure the entire book and are going to keep coming up again and again. And then we get to the double agent section and the notion of the agency, not just of the player, but of the non-human agents, and how music is often treated with agency. Games and characters in games are given agency in interesting ways. It goes beyond who has their hand on the controller. And again, comes back to the being in the room with the player 2 controller, has a bunch of influences than if the brother were playing totally alone, because you can be there encouraging, amusing, distracting, causing any number of slip-ups or successes in the play by being there with the other person to witness it. Gotta sip the coffee. Oh, it's so good. The coffee is so good today. So the non-human entities in games and their agency brings us to things like actor network theory. I like to abbreviate it to ANT. I think it's cute. Actor network theory, it draws on post-humanism discourses, and there ends up being a lot of anxiety about affording too much agency to non-human entities, but we'll get there. Players and avatars end up being kind of double agents, and so it's really interesting to understand that relationship and the way that a player might be identifying or not identifying with their avatar or their character. And this can extend to role-playing and identifying with characters, especially in games where you have to design your character and the character creation screens. I'm thinking even of like as recent as like Cyberpunk 2077, where you could spend forever just designing your kind of post-punk cyberpunk character, picking out the hair and exactly what you wanted them to look like, and the way that you may be sort of using a player that looks nothing like you, that is, a very different body than you, and how you might be sort of like imagining yourself in a very different place. But what I really like in this section is, Cheng is careful to say, these identities can't really be created from scratch. They aren't. So it makes us feel as though we're a totally different character. And certainly experienced role players are sort of acting in these roles that can be very different from how they might want to act in real life. But what roleplay affords is not the facile transcendence of corporeal existence, but rather effortful renegotiations of this existence's material contingencies and experiential boundaries. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting section that, I like thinking about this, because some folks really try to sort of make themselves in character creation, like make characters that look like them. And others just want to be as far from that as possible. And, maybe you get like a cisgender male player that's like always going to use a female avatar, and like sort of what that's doing. Why are they gravitating to that? What are they enacting? What are they renegotiating? And in music and in games, the performer or the player are also negotiating a double agency here with regard to control. So sometimes they are completely in control, but there's also an experience of sort of like a flow state when you're in performance and it's going really well, where people describe giving themselves over to not being in control and sort of being swept up, and how you have to maintain the control and not get swept up so much that you lose the control. It's like an interesting double consciousness that happens where we're arbitrating multiple states at the same time. And so, beyond all of this is to say we often casually attribute agency to music and to games, and how often we talk about the music does XYZ, the music is expressing this. There's a Taruscan example of the pathetic fallacy where the motet is said to revel in its polyphonicness, and pointing out the motet can't do that. The motet can't revel. We're the ones reveling in the polyphonicness of the motet. And so pointing out that, hello, it's the humans that have the agency here. But the fact that we so easily slip into putting the agency there and then talking about the humans sort of in passive voice is a really interesting thing. Very common and very, very important, because it shows sort of what we're ascribing the power of music. And I think this hits it on the head here that, according to this critique, ascribing agency to music can be problematic because doing so elides the roles and responsibilities of human agents. This said, running afoul of pathetic fallacies is not always a result of rhetorical apathy or worse, intentional prevarication. More often than not, bestowing music with vital properties is simply a way of accentuating its liveliness, dynamicism, and affinity with human conditions. Could have used that in my emotion seminar this semester, because that was something that we kept coming back to, and this idea of like expression of an emotion, sort of along certain topical expectations of how we express certain emotions versus actually invoking an emotion in a person. And there was a lot of kind of talk around this idea of agency, and the music expressing an emotion. It's not a person. It's not having an emotion. It's not sad, but we recognize that it's expressing sad, and how complicated that is. The sense of non-human agency for music and games is where a lot of these anxieties come from. We're scared of the non-human. But also, that it's kind of unchecked in a way. Honestly, this makes me think a lot about the AI art generators there's causing a lot of controversy right now. The Lensa app, because it used the diffusion, whatever sampling. I can't remember the name of the stable diffusion. Was that the name of it? And how artists are saying, you know, these things are being trained without consent. They're just sort of taking things, and then somebody is able to prompt the AI to do art in the style of the artist, who now is being cut out of that process. Their work isn't being licensed, and that it's all well and good to train the AI, but then the company is profiting on that and not paying the artist, and now the artist is losing commissions, or, you know, it's being kind of eaten up as just kind of belonging to the internet, and there is no recognition of where this actually came from, and that person's visibility is decreased because it's now associated with this app instead. So it's, you know, there are real world consequences here. A lot of anxieties in gaming relate to the sort of non-human agency of the game and kind of addicting you, right? And also potential uses of games to influence attitudes and beliefs, like the idea that games could be propaganda because we identify so strongly with them and we play them for such a long period of time versus watching a film. Most games, some games are only a couple hours long, but a lot of them, you know, they can be 60, 100, 300,000 hours where we're in the same game. And, you know, if that has a coded message, how is that affecting what we think? And of course, the violence in video games debates that always rage. General question, point of divergence. There seems to be a strong tendency for the personalization of the player, the psychological player avatar link. Yeah, I like that. And to that, there's the Google Doc again. So I would suggest, Andrew, throw that in the Google Doc, because my thought here is that we can kind of enter our questions as we go. So I'm going to start it off by just saying that I have questions about the reuse of chapters, articles from other / the same publisher mentioned in the acknowledgements, and the process of securing consent to rework those and reprint sections, etc. So yeah, feel free. Anybody can edit this and add to it. So lost link and no worries. I figure I'll just like kind of regularly link it as we go. So I'll just keep linking it throughout, and feel free. Anybody can go ahead and add questions that come up for you as we go through this, and as you're reading along, you know, certainly take note of any questions that you have on this. There we go. So then we get to the binary section. So fun. Everyone knows, like, most things are actually spectrums, not binaries, right? But we know that the world is often structured to sort of force these binaries, and exploring the relationship between the things that are seen as oppositional is very illuminating, because it gives us a better sense of the spectrum itself between, and sort of their, you know, in music and disability studies, for example, we sort of talk about how there is a clear sense of, you know, the point at which you kind of count as disabled in the rhetoric, and the example always often given is, you know, nobody would say that I'm disabled because I wear glasses, right? So like we recognize that that's kind of not serious enough to kind of identify with like a disabled identity, because of the level of participation in society that's still allowed despite the impairment. And the world is still built for me to participate within it, just with the sort of prosthetic of the eyeglasses or the contacts or the LASIK or whatever. So the visual impairment is, there is a point along that spectrum, you know, at which you sort of count as being on one side or the other of the able-disabled binary. But exploring that relationship gives us a better sense of the entire spectrum, and it also helps us to recognize boundaries that are often sort of ill-defined and that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, We like to sort of think of people on either end of the spectrum instead of just all the points along it that one can exist in. So the real virtual binary is a big one in this book. Synonyms for the virtual are vast. So it can be as neutral as just kind of referring to things being online, or computer mediated, or digital, or screen based. It can also refer to sort of fictional, imaginary spaces, potential spaces, hypothetical spaces. But on the negative side, it can be used to refer to instances of fakery, forgery, inauthenticity, delusion, deception, inconsequentiality, and immateriality. So he notes that this is virtual is a polysemous word, and the nature of the word is kind of maybe not celebrated, but we're not going to try to nail it down to one specific definition. We're going to revel in the fact that it has all of this meaning loaded into it. So the virtual, he describes it as a hydra, that it becomes more difficult to tame the more you try to pin it down. And anytime that you try to say, it is this or this, it's going to grow more heads. So for most, it's easier to talk around it than to define what it is. But the one thing that the virtual is the most alike, and that we can kind of say the most about, is that it is like the real, but not quite. It's not quite. The real is also complex, but it's often given ontological precedence in the pair. So, it's seen as superior to the virtual in many ways. So that's an interesting assumption to challenge. And so the real and the virtual are so often placed in scare quotes. We're sort of, because we recognize just how complicated both of these seemingly simple words is, how taken for granted a lot of these meanings are. I also put scare quotes. I talk about authenticity being a spiky word and needing scare quotes and having to be very carefully contextualized. So the terms are mundane yet esoteric, stiff yet volatile. I love that. I think that's true. But like any of these dichotomies, they're illuminating. And so just sort of dismissing them out of hand and saying you're not really going to deal with those terms doesn't really do much for you. So better to just acknowledge the complex nature of everything and engage with different aspects of them as you go, and just recognize that like trying to make it fit into one box is ultimately to ignore a lot of potential avenues that are important to your discussion. So trying to grapple with big ideas is hard, but it is what we do as academics. And most of us, pretty much anybody these days, doesn't have to be convinced of the importance of these mediated experiences, how significant, and not just a video game, but, a film that really touches you, a TV episode that made you cry, we understand that this can be really, really important. A song that you heard at a significant moment in your life, a breakup, or that reminds you of someone that you've lost. We know that anything technologically mediated is not completely removed from our real experiences, and so there's a feedback loop here where we can sort of ascribe experiences to what we experience, but we can also be affected by the media that we consume. But there's still this common thread of treating games as superficial. But I love this way to shut this down, that all of these think pieces that try to say that games are frivolous, that they don't matter, that they're a waste of time, that people should stop spending all this time in the virtual world and get out and live in the real world. It actually just confirms the subject is worthy of scrutiny. It's like, doth protest too much, right? Shut it down. So yeah, you can say they're superficial, but clearly they're not, because everybody has these meaningful, most people are having these really meaningful experiences with them, and they are here and they are important. But there's a lot of anxieties, just like about the agencies and the non-human agents in particular. There's anxieties about how the virtual might encroach on the real world, and how it could overtake, intersect with, and trespass on reality, as Will Cheng writes. So there's a lot of fear about the virtual becoming just as real, or maybe even being seen as more real than the real. Yikes. We're afraid of that. And this becomes all of this anxiety becomes most salient in the debates on game violence. So if we truly thought games were these isolated diversions and superficial and juvenile and they didn't matter, if they were this closed system, then we wouldn't worry. We would go, okay, the violence in the game is confined to the game, but there's a lot of fear about to what extent, is this causing antisocial behavior? Is this making someone potentially trigger happy in real life? And then, of course, then it intersects with like access to firearms in this country. And just the idea that that's a potential powder keg. And there's been so much research on both sides of that seem to not come to a simple conclusion, and there's replicability issues in just determining, because these are complex systems, so it's really hard to isolate the variables to study this properly. To what extent is the gaming actually causing someone to become more violent, or are these games appealing to people that already sort of have this tendency? Is it exacerbating them? Or, on the flip side, are violent games actually sort of a cathartic, healthy way to sort of purge these feelings and process them for a lot of people? Does there have to be one answer? It seems like the cultural discourse really wants there to be a simple answer to this. And in truth, there's a number of different answers that seem to present themselves. But if we didn't think that the real and the virtual really inflected one another and were imbricated in one another, then we wouldn't be so worried about violence, and not just violence, but sexuality and political agenda and any of these things appearing in games. We know that they can have real world consequences, and we don't fully understand how they work on that front, at least not in full. So we wouldn't care so much if we didn't know that there was a real issue here. So a lot of binaries. This is the list of binaries explored in the book, beyond real and virtual, which is also listed here. Utopia and dystopia, real and virtual, work and play, defiance and obedience, distinction and conformity, deviance and normativity, disinhibition and restraint, player and avatar, human and machine, authenticity, artificiality, severity and frivolity, embodiment and disembodiment, singularity and multiplicity, offline and online, music and noise, song and speech, text and performance, live and recorded, sound and silence, and expression and muteness. We're going to see those over and over. So throughout, we're going to see the real-world consequences of game sounds, but also the in-game consequences of encroaching real-world sounds, and that includes things like licensed familiar songs that may be a little bit sort of uncanny or bizarre to you when you're like, oh, that's that song. I know that from elsewhere. But in certain games that might actually be more immersive. Like I'm thinking of like sports games, Tony Hawk Pro Skater. We're hearing songs from the real world is actually sort of part of the world building versus like hearing a cover of Billie Eilish in Final Fantasy XIV. That was my very first day. I was wandering around the main plaza in Gridania, which is where I started, if you know Final Fantasy XIV. And in the plaza, there was somebody like obviously barding. There's like some sort of a music system that I haven't accessed yet, but they were playing Billie Eilish covers. And I was just like, whoa, that's weird. But I did stop and listen because I was also just like trying to get a sense of the interface, and everything was, there's a lot. It's a multiplayer game, so there's kind of a lot going on. And I was just fascinated at the folks that just kind of plop themselves they aren't like going off and questing. They decide that they want to sit and play their harp in this plaza. So the idea of the real world music making its way into the video game. Of course, there are in-game concerts. There was one that was heavily promoted on the Game Awards last night that was to take place right after the Game Awards concluded, that I don't think any of the stream team stayed up for. I was working on this, but other folks were just buried in final work for the semester. But certainly in-game concerts, we've seen people give concerts in like Fortnite and stuff too. There's been like things in Minecraft as well, but also voice chat, of course, encroaches on the game. So we also know that there are real world consequences of game sounds. So it's kind of fun to look at the music and the sound crossing across, the boundary here. So to explore this is to acknowledge that we are inherently looking at liminal spaces between the real and the virtual, the interfaces, and we recognize that game music is not confined to the screen. So then we get to the methodology, where video games are so many different things: technologies, toys, mediums, interfaces, and importantly, they are texts and they are places. And since games are so multifaceted, it makes sense to employ a diverse group of methods to explore them. So in this book, William Cheng looks at he uses field work, especially in the later chapters, hermeneutics, and draws from discourses ranging from ethnomusicology and musicology, communications, anthropology, sociology, philosophy, and others. It's real deep and broad, even though the case studies themselves, he describes it as very like close reading based for the most part. But as we can see, like it's partially because the foundation is so broad. The case studies sort of, I think, need to be more focused in order to kind of balance it, because otherwise you're trying to kind of do the history of everything, right? and a book like this can't do everything. And so it helps to kind of specialize because you're trying to sort of triangulate all of these different discourses. There's also an aim here to play with the process of scholarship itself, and to including employing multiple registers of tone to draw on work that is not traditionally academic. So we all know this, that plenty of gamers are like as expert in these sources as we are. We often on the stream cite our friends Jarell and Ader, who have given talks at like VGM together, who seem to know more about the music of Final Fantasy XIV than pretty much any scholar who's done work on the Final Fantasy series. Like they just have incredibly deep knowledge, even though they're not necessarily, they don't have PhDs, they aren't trained in sort of the methods we are. But there's just this huge wealth of expertise for folks that don't necessarily make a living in academic spaces. So, and this doesn't just include being able to talk about it, but maintaining Wikipedia articles, drafting walkthroughs, fueling debates. And he points out some gamers might articulate their ideas and experiences in a manner different from the conventions of academic prose, but their contributions to collective knowledge about games are no doubt indispensable to and inseparable from standard scholarly oeuvres. I hate that word. I always like can't pronounce it. It's too French for me. This is why I only read French. I don't speak Frenchy things out loud for fear of sounding awful. So we know this. We know that it's important to bring that knowledge and expertise into our work. And part of having a stream like this is that this stuff, we kind of show everyone what we're doing, and then we can kind of cross-pollinate a little bit and bring them into what we do, and show what's being done, and also pay tribute to what we see. Might be interesting to explore some of these types of sources, even on here, and just in terms of like the depth to which people have explored things, even if they're not putting it in standard prose. That's something I should consider, as like curating a list of those. Those would be some really interesting episodes to bring on. Interesting thought. And here we come back to the idea of there being a bumpy road to acceptance of game studies in academia because of the old perceptions of the medium as juvenile or frivolous. I've been asked this before about the idea of facing opposition to wanting to do game music studies, and how I'm lucky in that I wasn't the very first wave of folks trying to do this, that Casey Collins and Will Gibbons and Neil Lerner and those folks who had already done a bit of publishing in the area and sort of paved the way. But I also acknowledge that we owe a huge debt to film music studies, and that I feel like their process of gaining acceptance took longer than it did for us because we were sort of building on the back of all of that work to recognize the importance of music and media as a whole. And so this was just kind of, we were able to frame this as a new flavor of that. And so there is a little bit of having to contend with the idea of games themselves being more frivolous versus, films being able to recognize that there's a lot of art film or like indie film and, sort of more serious ones that we could look at. I imagine in film studies there could still be issues if somebody's studying a genre that is seen as maybe less rigorous or, too mainstream or popular. Like maybe folks looking at like Marvel movies or romantic comedy or, genre films might face opposition versus the ones that are doing sort of the highbrow art film. But all of that work to sort of legitimize the medium, I think made it a little less bumpy for us. But every now and then you do come across it. Like I definitely never had any professors sort of question that the idea that games were worthy in the first place. They just kind of told me, like with anything, just do the work well. And you kind of don't need to do any of that hand wringing and apologize. They were just kind of always like, just put your head down and, try to apply as much rigor and make sure that you are well read and, that you have a good framework for engaging this. But yeah. Yeah. Personal preference does influence, the sort of judgments about what other people should be working on. There's also just a lot of acknowledgement of multiplicity in the field that I've seen where it's kind of like there's space for, you can do that. And I don't know, there's just so much. Yeah, there a lot of the judgment comes from personal preference. Absolutely. Whereas I often want to see folks work on the things that I don't want to work on. I'm just like, oh, cool. They can write about that, and then I can cite it. But anyway, this isn't to push back against the point that we do encounter folks that sort of assume that games can't be serious. And, if their only exposure to a video game is, oh, I played some Sonic the Hedgehog in college, they don't spend a lot of time gaming, then, they may be really thrown by seeing some of these indie games, these artistic games that, you show them something like To the Moon or That Dragon Cancer for that matter. And a lot of them would be like, wow, I wouldn't have guessed that this was what happens in gaming, because they're sort of seeing a certain commercialized AAA, the stuff that is most marketed and sort of publicly visible layer of what games are and what they're capable of. So anyway, but just as there's some doubts here about whether the medium is grown up enough for study or whatever, anyone that does childhood studies is like, yeah, that's silly. We've actually spent too long not looking at like childhood and play. Really fascinating work happening over there. So just as like a Second Life player might be asked, well, why, or, any kind of virtual space where you're spending a ton of time, MMOs, might be asked like, why are you spending so much time in this virtual world when you could be in the real one? And even outside of games, like somebody who's spending all their time on a certain social media platform or like on like a Reddit forum or, whatever it is, you're spending all of this time in this fake virtual world. I think this is where we're implying virtual is fake. When you could be in the real one, like having real human connections. So just as there's that criticism lodged at some of these players, scholars are often asked, well, the ivory tower thing, you're spending so much time immersed in discourse about the subject. Are you trying to do anything about it? Like, are you just, where's your advocacy? Where's your political movement? Folks in identity studies that do, feminist or disability or gender and sexuality studies, there is a very real grappling with sort of the personal as political and your relationship to activism versus theory, and trying to sort of figure out, what spaces do you have agency, and do you have institutional power? What can you do? How can you do it? I think this is really salient for those of us that kind of live in identity studies, because that challenge has been there from the beginning, where a lot of disability studies kind of came out of disability rights coalescing in the wake of civil rights, and really picking up 60s, 70s, 80s. And beyond. And so a lot of folks come to it kind of knowing that, like, oh, I can't just hide in the library. I have to do what I can here. But scholars are often sort of treated as though they never get out and try to make any change, and they aren't engaging with anyone outside of their own bubble, and they just want to sit here with their dusty old books and talk about the subjects. So an interesting parallel drawn here between, like, the idea of retreat into a kind of a virtual world that's happening of both. So he does note that there are a lot of similarities to intense engagement with games and academia that are interesting to explore, as he talked about kind of the playfulness of scholarship. So then we get to the chapter walkthrough. There are going to be 5 case studies, each chosen for their potential to speak to controversial and far-reaching issues. The first 3 chapters are single-player games. The last 2 involve multiplayer games. And more ethnography, and an aim for depth within each case study instead of breadth, close readings instead of master narratives. And this is where I do think that this is an attempt to sort of balance the breadth of the discourses and the way that we're framing this particular case study. And I think that that's something to think about. Where are you going to, zoom in, and where are you going to try to set your broad framework and make sure that you have enough to build on, enough of a foundation. So there's caveats here that, there's no attempt to cover the entire history of games or every genre or anything. This is not about coming up with the grand unified theory of music and gaming, just noting that, like, a lot of these things are going to be applicable far beyond the specific game mentioned. But there is definitely, this is sort of a, scratch the surface. This text could be 1 million pages longer, right? And so notes, for example, that there's no engagement in this book with anything in, like, the 8-bit era. And basically says, there's already people out there that are doing really wonderful work on, like, chiptunes. And there's also no remarks on rhythm games, He cites Kerry Miller, for example. There's folks doing good work in a lot of these areas, and so it's not necessarily felt as like a neglect. It's just kind of like, I chose these 5 games for specific reasons because of the types of things I was interested in looking at. It's just a nice little caveat for some of the games are kind of grouped in the 90s. There's kind of a focus on games from the 90s, but that it's not meant to be snubbing any of these other genres or eras of history. It's just kind of like using these as representative cases. And the depth of that close reading is meant to then illuminate things about how sound works, even in other games. So chapter 1 is going to focus on Fallout 3 from 2008, with a particular interest in the in-game radio stations and the music the player can hear in the game world, ranging from 18th century classical. There's both classical and popular music reflected in those radio stations, and particularly there are provocative couplings that emerge in how this upbeat looping music gets randomly juxtaposed against the graphic acts of brutality that a player witnesses and commits in the game. Predicaments of human agency are explored through the lens of aesthetic autonomy, orality, trauma, the ethics and habits of play, and the impact of violence on music as we know it. It's a really fascinating chapter. I don't think I've returned to it in a while. It's been a while since I've read that one, but I remember being very kind of provoked by some of the things that it made me think about in a good way, like really challenged by thinking through sort of the ethics of it. So that's going to be a really fun one. That'll be next week. Chapter 2, which we'll come back to at the beginning of the year, focuses on Final Fantasy VI from 1994. And this is all about, it's particularly about the game in-game opera, but about the idea of the voice in the 16-bit sound. So the poetics of embedded spectacle, the signifying powers of synthesized sounds, and voices' phenomenal valencies. So the chapter focuses particularly on the opera, the singing, the which we often smile about, the lo 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 lo. The sampling of just, it's like a keyboard with ahs. It doesn't really like sound like, it's not somebody singing the words. And also Kefka's laugh is discussed in here. So this one I remember citing in my dissertation because of the Kefka laugh bit. So also you'll note that this predates the Pixel remaster, but there's going to be a section looking at the original 16-bit opera and modern real-world performances and arrangements, engaging nostalgia and fandom theory. So that could be an area that we explore a bit, and think to add that to the... Yeah, excellent. Questions for Chapter 2 about the Pixel remaster operas. I think that'll be really interesting. We can flesh that out more when we get to Chapter 2. But I'll add that to the list. I think that'll be a really interesting, fruitful area to explore. Because I remember when we streamed it and we had Annie Rosen on, and then we thought, we'll just watch a couple of the we ended up watching all the languages because it was really interesting to see the different performances within the languages that they had translated the aria into for the game. And, we had our favorites. We definitely had our favorites, and they were not the English version. But yeah, that's really interesting in terms of, in that case, we're going to get into questions of sort of like official, authentic. So there's some interesting things we're going to touch on with those. Chapter 3 focuses on Silent Hill from 1999 and survival horror, and how, of course, survival horror games are all about making you feel powerless, and how in a lot of games that's a bad thing. But here it heightens horror. And so, having like unreliable mechanics, labyrinthine environments, and defenseless protagonist is all about removing the kind of what you expect of games in general, because you've played plenty of other games where those things are not the case, where the mechanics are totally solid, and we spend a lot of time making sure those mechanics are solid, right? So the idea that things are sort of like not working as they should, or breaking or glitching, is a source of horror in itself. And this is a great game to explore that. And so here we're going to explore tensions between pleasure and terror, and power and powerlessness. Chapter 4 moves on to performance and performative agency, focusing on the Lord of the Rings Online, started in 2007, and its in-game music-making system. And just the complexities here, that some folks see this as, a really beautiful thing, as key to the virtual democracy of the world. Others are sort of anxious about the idea of like it's not real performance, and that it obscures real world musical talent. So there's some anxieties encroaching from the real world. And also we're going to look at the interactions between these performances, including disruptive ones, like players who come and play over others to make a scene, to cause problems. So less utopic moments here. And then Chapter 5 focuses on Team Fortress 2 from 2007, and specifically live voice chat in the online multiplayer games using the players' microphones. So this is where the trash talking comes in. And some players worry about basically what their voice is revealing about themselves, their own identity, versus the avatar being a space where you can be anonymous and disembodied. But as soon as you come on the mic, if you have a voice that is coded female, you might get a lot of harassment for that. And also like youth if you sound too young, you're going to face a different type of harassment. A lot of like young boys, face issues in those spaces. So here we're going to see ethnography foregrounding issues of gender politics and sexual harassment, and how players negotiate strategies of domination, masquerade, and coming out through acts of speech and of silence. So you can choose not to push to talk, right? And decide, I don't want to even invite that, so I'm just not gonna speak in those spaces. Yeah, the 8-year-olds playing Call of Duty, and sometimes the young ones are doing some of the most vehement, horrifying acts of speech in those spaces because they're trying to seem kind of more grown up or cool. They have a belief about like this is like the social norm in this space. They can be absolutely vicious. And that's kind of a norm that is created within particular games, because not every multiplayer game and not every multiplayer game with voice chat capabilities has like toxic trash talk. Some people find a lot of pleasure in that though. So it's like, I also don't want to deny that like it wouldn't have popped up if people didn't find it adding to the game in some way, or find some pleasure in it, or find it kind of safely transgressive, whatever it is. Maybe it's safely transgressive for some people, or cathartic, allows them to sort of like purge things that they would never say in real life. I don't know. There's a lot to unpack there, but then that those very acts can make that space inaccessible to some, can silence folks that don't want to participate in that, or face kind of undue attention due to not fitting the norm that's been constructed. And not every game has that, but a lot of them do, especially a lot of shooters have this element to them. But yeah, there's a lot to be said about comparing sort of different multiplayer games and their environments, and which ones seem to have more supportive communities versus being labeled as more toxic. There was a really good thread on this on Twitter a while back where someone was asking about like, what do you think is the most toxic community and what is like the most wholesome, yeah. I've never been very good at shooters, so it's not a space I've engaged in very much. Definitely not one of my strengths as a gamer. Give me an old school platformer, let me just play all the Mega Mans. And I actually have a lot of doing Final Fantasy XIV as my first MMO has been interesting, because like anytime that it's like kind of living in Final Fantasy world, I'm just like, oh cool, I'm comfortable with that because I'm used to that. But anytime that it's been like the folks in my Discord like show up to like be around me, I'm just like, oh, this is weird. I'm like not used to it yet. So I'll be hitting a point soon where I do kind of the first major dungeon, and they will come. A lot of them have said like, let us know, ping us, we'll come help. And that's like a whole new world to me. So at least I have that game has a system where you are given a little sprout icon to indicate that you're new. And it seems that it's cultivated a space where there's a lot of mentorship and kindness to those newbie players, instead of just like, me joining a first person shooter game and being the one that drags the team, or Rocket League for that matter, like where I'm seeded randomly into a game with people who are probably way better and that I end up bringing the team down because I'm just not as good. That's hard. And then you feel like I can't even do the practice to get the experience to like get to the level where I can participate, and so why bother? And this is something that online games have to contend with, especially as they exist for longer and longer. When you have new players, like how are they brought into the world and able to stick with it versus the folks that are like the expert players who've been around a long time. So after our chapter walkthrough, basically says any sound has the potential to be meaningful and palpable, promoting imaginations, musical, playful, and otherwise. By what criteria, then, does one define actual music, real musicians, and authentic musicality, and to what ends? Cool. All right, so that is the walkthrough of sound play from the beginning, and wanting to make sure that we covered the things that don't often get covered. The acknowledgements, which are gorgeous, and the foreword, which of course is celebrating the book and what it manages to do, but also is a nice distillation of some of the major ideas in the book. So it's a nice counterpart to the introduction. And so we will be spending the next 5 or so weeks on this, with a break for the holidays. And so next week we will do chapter 1, which is the Fallout 3 chapter, A Tune at the End of the World, and continue to add to our little document and kind of build up questions along the way. And, next week we'll actually be able to look at some of the examples, and it won't just be me talking quite so much. It'll still be me talking, but we'll work our way through it, and then after the holidays we'll go through the rest of it in turn. And then, like I said, William asked specifically if it would be too weird to pop in even as a lurker, and I was like, no, absolutely not. Please be here as you like. So I'm sure no one will be like scared to say anything just because Will might be in chat, because we will be able to kind of get into some of this. And my goal is that we will book club in and build up our own questions as we go, and then we will have a really vibrant discussion at the end. So hopefully this format works and we will enjoy it. But yeah, I think we can go enjoy our Fridays. And for me, that involves, I don't even know. I'm not making dinner tonight. We're getting takeout. So that's fun. I don't have to do that. I'm really excited about this. I wanted to make sure that just because they were longer texts, I thought about, well, I guess I could excerpt, because a lot of these books are structured that you could just read one chapter out of them. But I sort of thought it would be great to really go through a book in depth, especially one that I think is so useful to so many people. Like, this is one that I come back to, and I'm pretty much always have a reason to cite it in basically everything I do. So this one, Tim Summers' book, I was thinking of doing Understanding Video Game Music by Tim Summers possibly over next summer. The summer of summers, we can call it. Just so that there'll be a break before we do the next monograph, because this is a commitment to do a multi-week thing like this. But we will have some articles on here in the spring and chapters. I have to start engaging some of those folks to appear for, I guess, what I will call season 2. I'm not really breaking up into seasons, but yeah, I was thinking Summer of Summers would be kind of fun. I bet Tim would be on board for that. And there's going to be some interesting books coming out in the spring and beyond, including my own book. So maybe we'll do a couple of those chapters as well, because that would be really fun. It would be really cool to have like Lisa on to do her Cuphead chapter in the book, and things like that. So excited to see some of these things releasing. So yeah. What am I going to do today? I definitely want to play some Final Fantasy XIV, because I am on the cusp of like the first major dungeon, like the one that the Discord has said, like, tell us when you get there and we will be there. So I will probably do some of that tonight. Most of my grades are actually done. I kind of pre-graded everything but the final project, and my grades are sort of set up to be very like pass-fail, where as long as they have a passing final project, whatever grade they were already, at is going to stand. So as long as and most of the time, if they submitted something, it's probably not going to fail, But then I also have like a pass with distinction that can kind of like, if they're a little lacking in one category of something, they might be able to bring it up a little bit. I kind of leave discretion for that. If somebody just like blows it out of the water and does an absolutely incredible final project, which I do get. My grad students in the emotion seminar did some stunning work this semester. I was really into that. So the undergrads it's a classical appreciation course this term. So I'm really excited. There were some really interesting topics proposed there. including one that was kind of looking at video games as the inheritors of classical traditions, as being, the site where a lot of like orchestral music is happening, film as well. But this person was specifically interested in the idea that like a composer today is as likely to be writing for media as they are to be trying to secure commissions for concert performances. So I'm really excited to see that. So some good things coming in. Hopefully you all are not too buried and, are implementing systems to make sure that this doesn't bury you too much. And you can kind of move forward with that. But I wish you all well as you wrap up your respective semesters, and I hope that you get true rest and merriment and whatever you do or do not celebrate. New Year's. All of the same. We often do kind of quiet New Year's. Our newest tradition is we get a pizza from this wood-fired pizza place, and they do a fig and prosciutto pizza with arugula, and it's incredible. So we do that, and then we get like a bottle of champagne. So it's like pizza and champagne on New Year's. It's wonderful. So I think that is a really fun way to celebrate. It started obviously in COVID where we couldn't go anywhere, but it's been kind of, I look forward to it now instead of thinking about like having to go to a party or something. It's like put a fun movie on and do that. And I leave my decorations up into January because I like them. They're pretty. So I figure you can at least leave them up to like, if you're on a Christian calendar, you can at least leave them up till Epiphany, right? There ain't no shame in that. But yeah, I have all of the decor on myself and otherwise. And yeah. Anyway, I'm rambling because I don't know what I'm going to do next. Probably go to the store. I ran out of groceries for the week. So if I'm going to make anything for dinner tomorrow, I need to go buy it. But yeah, as always, like, comment, subscribe. I'm kidding. This isn't YouTube. Join us next week. Continue to read along with the Cheng if you have it. If you have access to, borrow a copy. I believe there's I should have checked if there's I think there is an ebook version that you can get if you'd like a personal copy. I recommend adding it to one's library if you're able to find it inexpensively at it, and I think it's super worthwhile. I'm excited to spend the rest of the time on this, and we'll see you next Thursday night. The stream team I think is going to do like an end of semester decompression Jackbox game round. We decompressed yesterday as well by just watching the Game Awards and commenting. We didn't play anything yesterday, but I think we're just going to do like really, really fun community gaming next week, and then next Friday we'll do this. And yeah, if you have anything that comes up in the meantime, let me know. If you have anything you want to add to the our little book club question outline, let me know. Thank you all for joining me. Enjoy your Friday. Bye.